Hi everyone, I wanted to talk about the Scales from Rabbath, Book 3 today. This is a book that can be very overwhelming if you first get it without any instructions or if you just try to make up your own system to go through the scales. And so I wanted to just give a brief overview of how you can start breaking these down. First of all, you'll want to have a couple prereqs taken care of. You want to know at least your 2-octave scales, all of them, all the major scales. Preferably know all your 3-octave scales with just a set fingering that works for you before you expand to these scales. Second, you need to have a bass that is very playable, where the strings aren't a ridiculous amount of space off the fingerboard, so you can play up in the upper registers with ease. Third, you need to be familiar with the pivot as Rabbath shows in his techniques. That's a whole nother video there, but those are the things that you want to know before you dive into this. So let's take a look at the page and see how it breaks down. First of all, you'll see at the top of the page there are 3 lines of debut, or the beginning of the scale. This is pretty much the first octave, or sometimes an octave and a half, depending on the key that you're looking at. Then there's the ending of the scales, a bunch of those variations. The next section is arpeggios. That's followed by complete scales, which are additional variations to the ones from before. Then you have double stops, and then you have alternating thirds. So you'll notice that if you take the opening scale number 1 and match it to all the top variations, and then you take the opening number 2, match it to all the tops, opening number 3, match it to all the tops, you get quite a few variations. For C major, that's 117 variations, and then Rabbath begins the complete scales from 118 through 133. So that's 133 variations of a C major scale. That sounds overwhelming, but first of all, it's good to know why you're doing this. Number 1 is to expand your fingering vocabulary, pretty much. A bunch of these scales are probably not ones that you would naturally pick yourself if you're trying to find the easiest way to do a scale. But like with any vocabulary, once you learn it and it's sort of in your toolbox, you actually start finding reasons to use a bunch of this. They can be helpful ways to solve problems in passage work, or it might just open your mind up about how you can work out different pieces. So that is one. The second one, which is less glamorous but true, is that as bass players we need to build up stamina and spend a good bit of time every day in the practice room playing through notes. Not just playing a note and then thinking about something else and fixing it, but you actually have to spend time with your fingers on the fingerboard, moving up and down, resonating the instrument constantly. So you start to really get in shape so that you can handle long hours doing whatever it is you do, whether it's jazz, whether it's orchestra, whether it's solo work, any combination of that and many other things. It's actually helpful to spend half an hour or even up to an hour perhaps doing these scales a day. It can seem a bit overwhelming, but if you do this for several days in a row, say even 30 minutes doing this, you'll find that your stamina starts increasing and you will feel much more comfortable for any other playing that you're doing. I know that when I've needed to take a break from playing for a week or so if I'm on vacation or something else is going on and I come back, this is usually the first thing I come back to, just to get myself back in the saddle basically and feeling what it's like to play the bass. So let's talk about how you can break this down. I'm going to give you 3 variations, or 3 versions. One is going to be the quick version. You're going to pair debut 1, the beginning scale, half of the scale, number 1, with all the top ones. Take that, first 4 arpeggios, and alternating thirds at the end. That's a nice beginning workout. Version number 2, take all of the bottom scales and match them with all of the top ones. That's going to be more of an endeavor, but do it at a moderate tempo. So quarter note at 60 and playing everything in quarter notes. So that means beginning number 1 with 1, then 1 with 2, 1 with 3, 1 with 4, then 2 with 1, 2 with 2, 2 with 3. You might want to break this up over 2 or 3 days, but even if you break it up over 3 days, make sure you pick up where you stopped, because going through this methodically is a very important thing. If you just skip around, you're probably going to lose your focus and you might not stick with the book. So it's a good idea to stay very methodically as you go through it. Then you can start to add more arpeggios and the thirds. Once you get comfortable with the fingerings, then I would suggest trying to get through at least half of the scale variations in one sitting with the arpeggios, and then adding the double stops. Double stop thirds, fourths, fifths, octaves, and unisons. And a quick note about these, a lot of people also complain, when am I going to play double stops? Well, first of all, they're useful simply for your hand position, learning the thirds throughout the different positions, learning the fourths, which often we would call bars, as you play through different positions of the bass, learning fifths, which we use all the time as far as broken chords, especially in classical music. When you're outlining a chord, we do fifths all the time, and you certainly do it in jazz. So just knowing that hand position throughout the fingerboard. Octaves are useful not always to be played on their own in passage work, but for learning the spacing of an octave. So if you're playing a low note with your thumb, the lower note with your thumb, and you need to do a jump to an octave or something close to an octave, you already know what that hand shape feels like. Your hand can just recall that shape. So it's not necessarily just learning how to play octaves, but just learning these shapes of your hands. Same thing with the unison. And then the alternating thirds can be a good cool down. So if you go through this methodically, you're much more likely to stick with it and find the value in this combination of things. There are a lot more exercises and material towards the end of the book, but for now I just wanted to stick with how to break down the scales. I hope that was helpful, and please come back to the channel for more videos.